stars are calling, the curtain is drawn. How far we have fallen, I'm out on the run. Live in the violence, die by the sword. Deep in the fire, that's where darkness is born.
Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Happy holidays. I hope you had a really great week. But I also know how hard the holidays can be for many people. One of my best friend's mom actually passed away this past week after an incredibly brave battle with cancer, just a truly amazing woman. And now I can't stop thinking about how hard the holidays must be for those of us, people out there who've lost loved ones that week or throughout the holidays. And I also recall when I was in my abusive relationship, just how horrible it could be when he was home. That abuse escalated, whether it was because family was around more, or he was home more, or financial stresses, or just more alcohol, whatever the reason, it would escalate. And then I would feel terribly isolated if he was deployed because I would want to go home to see my family, but that would piss him off. So it was just not good. And I've touched on the challenges of holidays while in an abusive relationship back at Thanksgiving, but it's again top of mind. So I just wanted to recognize that not all people are feeling cheery this time of year, and that's okay. I just hope you take some time to find some solace for yourself. Also, I do apologize that this episode is like a week late. I'm trying really hard to put out episodes weekly now, and I skipped a week actually unintentionally just due to sick kids. It's constant, and some travel and school plays, and just life got a little hectic. So today's actually going to be a two-parter. So expect the next episode by, let's see, tomorrow. It's going to release Friday. You'll have it by Monday. And then I'll put out next week's episode a few days later. So a few episodes over the next couple days to make up for my missing one. This week, I'm still discussing domestic violence on the bases in Hawaii, but also we're going to dive into a lot of cover-ups and conspiracy theories. Some emails I've been getting from listeners, crazy. And of course, I'll also be spiraling down multiple rabbit holes per usual. So I'll cover all of that today. And then in my part two of this episode, I'm going to be diving into two different stories of service members killing their significant others in the last few years at Hawaiian bases. I also want to mention the wife who was found dead in Kaneohe Bay, Hawaii on September 1st, whom I've been discussing here and on my social media. There's been just absolutely no information released about her in nearly 4 months. And while I don't necessarily expect a homicide charge or a significant outcome regarding the investigation surrounding her death at this point, the secrecy is disconcerting to me. It's apparently being investigated currently, or I should say, the most recent articles I could find on the matter, which was from back in mid September, stated that NCIS was actively investigating the death. The particular article I'm referencing also mentioned how odd it was that zero information had been released, including how the victim was related to the military member, though since then, multiple news sources have referred to the dead woman as a Marine spouse, but no other details were released, such as cause of death, the Marine's rank, and any other just relevant information, which is abnormal. Actually, the article I was reading was on military.com, and they said they sent the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing and NCIS a list of detailed questions, but no answers were given. They noted the ongoing investigation and confirmed that a Marine was currently in confinement in connection with the event, but they didn't indicate anything else. They said no charges had been filed at that time, which again was September 13th when that article was published. In other cases, even when the cause of death is questionable, natural, suicide, homicide, by the evening news, there's usually a name, but this time nothing. And the same goes for the military wife killed in Japan in early October, and her spouse was detained as well. It's plaguing me. I literally wake up every day and do so much Googling and Reddit sleuthing, just trying to find out if there's any updates, and nothing about either of those wives. So if you're a journalist, NCIS, or in a related career field and know more about these types of situations, just contact me and enlighten me if there's a legitimate reason why this is not being shared. It just seems odd that there's so many other wives have died, and despite not knowing what happened, we had their names and their spouses' names. I can't think of how or why it would jeopardize the case to release names. And obviously, this isn't my area of expertise. I've had people comment in my comment sections that it might be to protect the Marine from being wrongfully accused by like the general public if by some chance the woman died from natural causes. But that just doesn't jive because not a single other person in America gets that type of respect or consideration. I can think of so many examples off the top of my head where there's a death and the names are released right away, despite not knowing the cause of death. And it seems a lot more likely that the military is trying to protect the military than the actual Marine. And it just makes me wonder if he might be an officer or something, or why that layer of protection. Just a quiet release about a dependent found dead at Kaneohe Bay and a Marine taken into custody. But given the number of murders happening there, I'm not entirely shocked. I mean, call me a conspiracy theorist, as many have, but my personal guess is that Brass is doing everything in their power to keep it under wraps. The fact that they found this woman while an active search for military spouse Misha Johnson and her almost full term baby was currently happening in Honolulu, just 11 miles away, speaks volumes about the domestic violence environment in Hawaii. All these murders are probably not great for a state that makes a lot of money off tourism either. It's no wonder there's a reputation for locals in Hawaii hating the military bases and personnel being there. Because the Hawaiians aren't the ones committing the crimes there, the violent crimes. Hawaii has always had a lower violent crime rate than the rest of the USA. But these service members are definitely jeopardizing that statistic. Now, I've mentioned that I'm going to be sharing the stories of 9 different lives lost in the last handful of years in Hawaii. But I should mention, if we go back further, there have been several murders by service members stationed at Hawaiian bases. Yesterday, I was doing some research and realized that no matter what year I put in, there was almost always a story that would pop up. For example, I put in the year 2002 murders on Hawaiian bases, and the murder of victim Zelaya de Armin popped up. Zaleha was a military wife married to a Pearl Harbor sailor, and she'd been trying to leave her abusive husband for quite some time. They had 3 children around the age 5 and under. And in May of 2002, Zaleha had asked the court for a restraining order from her husband, Petty Officer David Allen DeArmond. She filed for that restraining order May 3rd, and just 1 month later, Zaleha would be beaten to death by her estranged husband. Her mother, Binti Abdul Ghani, 66 years old, was also murdered. Her brave mother jumped into the beating trying to save her daughter. Zaleha was beaten to death and her mother savagely stabbed multiple times. David would actually go on to admit that after murdering his wife, he would rape her corpse. Despicable. David's mother, who we could see raised a piece of shit, would be quoted in the news as saying that it was Zaleha's fault. She probably pushed all the right buttons or cheated on him and caused him to snap. And if you want to know why men grew up entitled, look no farther than moms like that. I'd really like to hear her excuse for why he raped her after she was dead or at all, but she probably dressed slutty, you know? Anyways, it's important to note in Zaleha's defense that David was convicted of domestic abuse for choking out his first wife, Jeanette, in 1995 in San Diego while stationed here. He was simply given 3 months of probation. And this is my grievance with the military. If you don't know or haven't heard me previously quote this statistic, an abuser who chokes or strangles his victim is 750% more likely to murder them. It's the number one predictor of murder from an intimate partner. So there were numerous other murders throughout the years. I actually found a father who was raping his biological teen daughter convicted. I found a lot of child abuse, and I'm talking from service members, all of these things, so many things. And I'm going to share a few of those. I'm hyper focused on Hawaii right now for several reasons, but it's important to note that this is happening at United States bases all over the world. There's just been a cluster of murders recently, so I'm focused on Hawaii. I did want to also mention that Misha Johnson's mother, the young gal who has been declared dead and her husband has been arrested from Schofield Barracks. I don't believe they found her body. She was near full term with their baby, but I do know they have reason to declare it a homicide, right? So something has been found. But her mother did find me on social media and reach out and give me her phone number, and she wants to chat. We haven't decided yet if that's going to be her coming on the show. I'm not sure, what legalities there are for her. I'm sure she would need to consult a lawyer, or if she just wants me to share some things about Misha that she'd like the world to know. But whatever I can do to support her as she's going through this. So that will be coming up in the next episodes as we focus on Hawaii. So again, regarding that unidentified wife in Kaneohe Bay, people have been reaching out to me lately with different things they've heard about the situation. One military spouse who said she lived in the same neighborhood as the unidentified victim mentioned that the Marine husband was found in the house with his wife's dead body, and their children were there too, and allegedly child services had to come to get the kids. Now, full disclosure, this is information from a source I can't really vet. And so at this point, it's really just alleged hearsay. But I actually saw that on a few different threads on different social media platforms, the same sentiment being echoed. And I do have some sources I regularly go to for the latest military chatter, if you will. And I found some local Marines from Hawaii. And the gist of what they heard was that this particular Marine was a NCO who had beat the wife to death, and the kids were there. Now, for those of you who don't know military acronyms, an NCO stands for a non commissioned officer, meaning they earn their officer status by climbing through the ranks, an enlisted service member who then gained officer status. The other option is to go through a military academy, and you'd be considered commissioned by head of state or an authority like that. So, anyways, in talking to those local Marines, they were back and forth on the cause of death. One said he was sure the husband had strangled her, but the other said he was pretty sure he'd beaten her to death. And the rumor was he had been violent with her regularly. They said he was taken to Tripler Army Medical Center for medical attention, and they heard it was because he was in a homicidal rage. But another had heard it was because the wife had injured him trying to fight him off. And if any of this is true, I hope it's the latter and that she left some considerable damage. Another Marine added that he heard that the man was allegedly claiming he was blacked out drunk and didn't know what happened. Now, that sounds unlikely, but he wouldn't be the first service member to use this excuse after murdering a significant other. In 2018, in Fredericksburg, Virginia, young mother and Marine herself, Natasha Soto Rivera, was beaten to death by her Marine husband, who claimed he woke up at a hotel with his wife after the Marine ball the night before, and he found his wife beaten savagely to death. He called the police and told them on that 911 call that he had blacked out drinking and beat his wife to death, and he added that he had an anger issue. Clearly, the story I'm going to do on part 2 of this episode is about a soldier from Schofield Barracks who in 2020 killed 2 dependents, and that was his defense as well. So apparently, blacking out drunk and murdering loved ones is a defense among service members who murder. And I will say a huge problem of service members is the excessive alcohol use and binge drinking. I don't think that alone could cause murder, though from my own experience, it always exacerbated escalation of anger, abuse, violence, rage, all of those things. So it didn't do any good. Now, all of this stuff I've just shared, I want to reiterate that those were all local lore, right? None of it has been proven or coming from a source of that's verified. But I will say I saw enough different sources and information on different unrelated sites that I think there must be some truth behind it. But for now, it's just unsubstantiated allegations, but I really hope that they release some information on this wife soon. And I'm just so invested in it because I feel like the military is not making the highly necessary systemic changes in any way. And it's so dire. And instead of acknowledging it and doing that hard work to fix the system, they just find ways to reactively cover things up. I think they're just trying to bury the story about the wife at Kaneohe Bay and the one found dead in Japan. And then maybe they'll quietly release a little media comment, something that is very gray and maybe even classified as a suicide. But I, for one, am not letting it slide. I want every single military spouse victim to be named because it is far too common. And if you have more information to share about this Kaneohe Bay case, or you want to tell me how to correctly pronounce that, you can email me at healingwounds13@gmail.com. And I promise you, I always keep my sources confidential. You don't even have to divulge your name, and I won't share your email by screenshot or anything on that on social media. But honestly, if you guys could peek into my emails, they're getting unhinged. Not unhinged as in necessarily unbelievable, just as in this nation's military is truly out of control. And nothing surprises me anymore, but it's shocking. You know what I mean? Like every time I open a new one, my jaw is on the floor. And I don't know why. Some of it I've witnessed and experienced myself. But I guess it's just the audacity of it all still going on that just shocks me. And all of it often still covered up or swept under the rug. It just enrages me. So I'm going to share a few of these emails and my thoughts along with them. And you might think I'm delusional, but let's just all slap on some tin hats and humor me for a few minutes, shall we? The first thing I want to share is my firm belief that many military wives classified as suicides were actually murdered by their husbands. I also believe that many military men reported as suicides might be cover ups for something much more sinister. This week, I posted about the subject of suicides and cover ups on social media. And a military wife she's actually a widow, her husband died by suicide on base years ago. She commented, and it led to us starting a private conversation. And she shared that she's part of a military widow group. And she said several women in that group believe their husband's death were wrongfully and intentionally classified as suicides to cover up murder, and that they've been fighting for years to get somebody from the DoD to listen to them, but the military won't, hasn't investigated or responded to them, and that lots of these cases are 10 to 20 years old. So when I say I believe there are many murders being covered up, I'm not standing alone on that subject matter or without some substantial claims. I also believe that there are a lot of service members who commit suicide after being sexually assaulted by other service members or who were murdered by other service members to cover up a sexual assault. I have a long list of victims whose stories I plan to share when I move to that topic of military sexual trauma. I'm working on that now, and this list includes women who had been raped by superiors, commanders, women who'd been assaulted by their comrades and nobody listened, or there was retaliation when they did report, and they committed suicide. Or did they? Suicide is obviously quite prevalent among service members, so yes, a lot of them did die by suicide. But there's also a history of cover ups of murder or even accidental or negligent deaths in the military. The DoD will change the narrative of a story to protect themselves. Now, there are multiple cases I can bring up that the military has classified as suicide or even as combat deaths, but they were not. Perhaps the most notorious of those cases being the late Pat Tillman. For those of you who aren't familiar, let me quickly recap that, and I'll keep it short because I think most people are fairly familiar with this. But Pat Tillman he was legendary. He was a safety in the NFL. He'd played college football for the ASU Sun Devils in Phoenix, and then he went on to play for the Arizona Cardinals and was really successful. And after 4 seasons, he upped and joined the military with his brother shortly after 9/11. And he actually went on to become an Army Ranger, which is no easy feat. He served several combat tours before he was killed, allegedly in the mountains of Afghanistan in 2004. Now, the Army would report to the Tillman family that Pat had been killed by enemy fire, when in reality, he had been killed by one of his own in, quote, friendly fire incident. The family and other critics of the Department of Defense would allege that they believe the DoD intentionally misclassified Pat's death until his memorial ceremony had passed to protect the image of the military. But in 2007, the Pentagon would release a report that his death was accidental. It wasn't that long after Patrick's actual death that the truth came out. I mean, who knows what the actual truth is, but they released a statement after his memorial service in 2004, divulging that Patrick was not actually killed in combat. And perhaps because of his fame, the military covered up how he died intentionally. Although, I also find it incredibly interesting that Pat Tillman had spoken out and been a very vocal critic about the war. He had referred to the invasions and occupation of Iraq as, quote, fucking illegal, a sentiment a lot of service members coming home from Iraq seemed to share. Many left the war feeling angry, betrayed, and with moral injuries coming home from a country they felt we never should have been in. For many questioning the legality of the invasion of Iraq, they felt that the invasion of Iraq was unjustified and unsanctioned by the United Nations Charter, and with the U.S. invading Iraq, that the U.S. was violating international humanitarian laws. Now, I'm totally spiraling here, but I just sometimes wonder if maybe, just maybe, if a person with the star power of an NFL turned Army Ranger American war hero is very vocal about war crimes, and then he just happens to die in an accidental friendly fire event in Afghanistan with 3 shots to the head, just maybe it wasn't an accident. But who knows? I could be totally out of bounds, but my trust for the Department of Defense is paper thin at this point. Because Pat Tillman's cover up isn't a one off. This happens all of the time. And I'm going to share a few of those cases with you now. And some of these have been reopened and rectified as best they could be, and some have not, and they are appalling. Some are still actively being fought for by families and advocates to be reopened. The most horrific case I can think of being Lavinia Johnson, a young woman in private first class found dead in a contractor's tent in Iraq in 2005. Lavinia had been raped prior to her murder, and then it would seem again raped at the time of her murder. It was classified as a suicide in 2005, but her autopsy would show major inconsistencies with a suicide. Now, I read an interview with Lavinia's father, and I'm actually going to link it because I think it's eye opening to read, so please check it out. But her father, Dr. John Johnson, a military veteran, he's been the driving force behind trying to get justice for his daughter. So, what I'm about to share, I pulled straight from his testimony during interviews with media outlets. Dr. Johnson shared that Lavinia had a broken nose, loose teeth, and perhaps the most jarring sign of her not dying by suicide, she had chemical burns all over her genitals. She also had a gunshot wound from a gun that, given its size and Lavinia's small stature, she just couldn't have ergonomically shot herself with. Now, I'm not a gun expert, but the gun in question that killed Lavinia was an M16 rifle. That's a gun that measures about 40 inches long. And Lavinia, small but mighty, was no more than 5'1" tall. As Dr. Johnson described it, even if Lavinia found a way to get that gun into her mouth, it would have blown her head off. Also, the bullet wound's exit and entry made no sense. Lavinia was right handed, and the bullet hole was in the left side of her head. Also, of note and incredibly bizarre, Lavinia had gloves glued onto her hands. And yet, despite all of this evidence, the United States Department of Defense will not acknowledge that it wasn't a suicide. There's been a ton of backlash and advocacy to reopen and reclassify this case, but there's been no successful end to the family's plight, which makes you wonder, who are they protecting? Another woman, Kamisha Block, an Army soldier serving as a military police officer who was killed in 2007, was falsely reported to her family as dying from a single shot to her chest by, quote, friendly fire. When her family pushed for more answers from the military, they continued to tell her family it was a non combat related incident they were investigating. The family was led to believe she was shot once in the chest on a dusty road during a top secret mission nobody could talk about. But once Kamisha's body was returned to the Block family and they had a chance to look at her and say their final goodbyes, they would notice that below the makeup that had been adorned on Kamisha's face for her final service, she looked to have bruising. And after more examining, the Block family would realize the bruising was actually another bullet wound. In the end, Kamisha didn't have a single bullet wound to her chest, but 5 bullet wounds throughout her body. After years of fighting, in 2019, it was determined that Kamisha's supervisor had murdered her and then killed himself. I know this is a much deeper story, so I'd urge you to look her story up. There's a lot of actually information out there on this one and some other podcasts that have covered it. And I hope one day to do it also, a deep dive, but really check it out because she did endure domestic violence. In yet another case, a 19-year-old woman named Morgan Macbeth died by stab wound that the Army would bounce around on the origination of. Morgan was in the 82nd Airborne as a paramedic, and then she trained as a paratrooper and ended up in the 1st Brigade Special Troops Battalion, the 82nd Airborne of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. An incredibly special girl. I haven't been able to find any podcast covering her story. and will really tick you off because her family was absolutely put through it by the military. Morgan died on an operating table as a military doctor tried to save her from a stab wound that started below her collarbone and it went down into a lung and her heart, an incredibly deep stab wound. The Army declared her death non combat related and essentially closed the case, saying it was a result of an accident. The families pushed for answers, but little was done to help the family. The family said the Army essentially changed the story several times and then turned their backs on them. They were told that Morgan accidentally stabbed herself, and then when the family continued to prod, they changed that to Morgan committed suicide. Then more testimony began to emerge from two soldiers who had been with Morgan when she was stabbed, and a false narrative was born. The two soldiers who were with Morgan on the night of her death were Tyler Kane and Nicholas Bailey. And Morgan's family would recall that Morgan had shared she'd been dating Tyler Kane, but that something felt off about him and she wanted to end their romance. When questioned, Kane and Bailey painted an unbelievable story about the three close friends horsing around in what they called a complete accident. Morgan was stabbed. But the family wasn't buying any of it. Eventually, the men were arrested. Kane and Bailey collaborated and they came up with this bullshit story about how they were all hanging out in a vacant tent, throwing 4-inch knives at a poster pinned to the tent's thin fabric. Kane had testified that Bailey had been playing around with the knife, and when he yanked it from the wall, he turned around quickly and accidentally stabbed Morgan. The Army would charge Bailey with involuntary manslaughter, but that story would then again change. Kane would then tell a different story. He would say Bailey had been wildly brandishing that knife around and was stabbing walls and stabbed Morgan, but accidentally. So nothing consistent, to say the least. The military upped the charge from involuntary manslaughter to negligent homicide for Bailey, and Kane was charged with obstruction of justice and giving false statements. And what jail time did he get for his lies? That man was given 45 days in the brig and a reduction of rank. That's all. He's still probably serving. Now, one of the key elements in this story is that when Morgan was rushed to the hospital by an emergency responder and contractor for the DoD, she was still conscious. And in Morgan's dying last words, she would tell that man that there was an altercation. Emergency responder was scheduled to testify in the case against Kane and Bailey, but he never showed up. The reason given? He was unavailable on a Carnival cruise ship, which is unbelievable. I have no idea if that excuse is true, but it would make sense if he was intimidated to not come and that was the lie. Hell, the military probably sent him on an all expense paid Carnival cruise. The fact they couldn't reschedule it, that's insanity. During the court proceedings, at least one Army surgeon and one military investigator felt strongly that the stab wound could not have been accidentally obtained. The special agent who investigated said that he couldn't imagine how a knife could be plunged so deeply all the way to the hilt of the knife without intention. The surgeon testified that he spent several hours fighting the overwhelming blood loss that Morgan was enduring, and that the wound was so deep he'd never seen an accidental stabbing like that. He testified, in an accidental stabbing, the moment a person feels resistance, human nature is to back off, and that reflex is lightning quick. But in the end, these men basically got away with murder. Tyler Kane, as I mentioned, received a slap on the wrist, and the man allegedly wielding that knife, Nicholas Bailey, was sentenced in 2020 to 9 months in prison. 9 months. Unfathomable. I share this story because it's like the other women I brought up. It just shows how much the military is willing to give leniency to criminals if they are their own. They just don't value the women's lives and safety as much as they value the soldier who commits the crimes. Sadly, even when the woman in question is one of their own, they'll do anything to avoid bringing a negative spotlight to the military as a whole. And another article that I read stated that Morgan was found with those two men naked, but I haven't been able to confirm that. I think there's a great deal of cover-ups happening, and they've happened for decades. At the bare minimum, a lot of blundered, sloppy investigations and the military doing its worst to cover up rape or murder or covering up a rape with a murder. I also think that some of the military wives who do complete suicide may have been intentionally coerced by abusers who were done being married and just wanted out. Or they were driven there by years of relentless abuse, and every time they tried to leave the situation, that post separation abuse just escalated to a level that made it impossible, and they felt the only way out was death. Now, if you've ever tried to leave an abuser, specifically a service member, that post separation can sometimes involve their buddies aiding them in the abuse. I know it did for me. Threats from his friends and other scare tactics. I even had one of his first shirts. He found my location and dropped my abuser off where I was, and it was literally hours after he had issued a no contact order against my ex husband. Now, when a victim leaves an abuser, that post separation abuse will involve levels of harassment or unwanted contact and problems for friends and family as that abuser is working to drive their victim home, whether it's through gaslighting the friends and family to advocate on his behalf or harass them and threaten them as well. This just increases that feeling in victims that they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. They think if I leave, everyone in my proximity goes through misery. If I stay, my daily life is torture. It's an incredibly dark place to be. And honestly, I began to experience very dark thoughts and suicidal ideation back when I was trapped in that abusive cycle myself. Lucky for me, I told my mom because I wanted help getting my dog out first, and she immediately got to work. She was the hero of my escape. Thanks, Mama. So, the fact that I felt that way, I think it speaks volumes because if I could get to that dark place, a person who never wanted to die and was never suicidal prior to that abusive relationship or since, it just really illustrates what an absolute mindfuck domestic violence is. I've said this before, but I came from a background of an idyllic childhood, no history of trauma, no people in my lives that displayed abusive relationships or anything like that. I was a truly happy person, and I ended up there. I don't know how a person with a history of trauma and depression gets through it, and it's just truly commendable. And you might think it's not possible for anyone to convince another person to complete suicide or to drive them to want to. But I assure you, many victims of domestic violence can tell you outside of that abusive relationship, they would have never even considered it. But in those pits of despair, when it feels like you will never escape, it can truly, certainly be something you start to entertain. So I received a direct message from a woman whose friend died in 2023 under allegedly very questionable circumstances. She was in an abusive relationship and wanted out. It was quickly ruled a suicide. The husband then immediately moved in with his pregnant mistress, along with him and his dead wife's kids, and then sold their marital home, like all of that instantly. So this woman is sending me affidavits with more information. If there's any validity there or anyone who has any like grain of proof, I'll start digging and sharing and looking into it. Maybe nothing, but I do believe this is something that happens. And one detail that piqued my interest is that this happened just months before their 10-year anniversary. For those unfamiliar with military divorce, if you're married to a service member for 10 years and they have at least 10 years of service and you get a divorce, the spouse of the service member becomes entitled to certain benefits. The USFSPA, that's an acronym for the Uniformed Services Former Spouses Protection Act, is a key factor in how military pensions are shared upon divorce. They'll classify military retiree pay as marital property and split it between the spouses. The division, however, isn't automatic and is at the court's discretion, which considers criteria such as the length of the marriage, the duration of military duty, and the overlap between those two periods. So that 1010 rule grants the spouse of the service member a provision that allows them to receive direct payments from the Defense Finance and Accounting Service if the couple's 10 years of marriage overlapped with the service of military time. Now, if you actually hit 20 years, that's the 2020, which is 20 years of marriage, 20 years of service, and those two things overlapped for 20 years, that then makes a spouse eligible to receive continuous health care benefits after the divorce. And now listen, before you jump to the old women stay with service members for 10 years for retirement bandwagon, let me just tell you, because I've heard this. I was with my ex-husband for 5 years, and I would not have stayed with that man for 5 more years if there was a $5 million cash prize waiting for me at the finish line. I promise you. As soon as I had an escape, there was smoke coming from me. No amount of money in the world would have been worth the abuse. So the idea a woman would stay with an abuser for money is just offensive. Almost always they're trapped and have no choice. Usually they have children involved, and that's the reason they can't leave. The abuser will go for custody if they do and have a very good chance of getting it. And I've dived into all of that in other episodes, so I digress. Okay, next email, and this one is slightly slightly related to what we just talked about, but it's a bit conspiracy theory-ish. And it may sound crazy, it sounds pretty unbelievable, but still, I don't think impossible knowing what I know about the military, but just buckle up. A woman wrote me and said at Fort Bliss, El Paso, there's a high rate of suicide among the female dependents. She alleges that the highest ranking soldiers there will have affairs with women they have sought out and believed to be easily manipulated or weak. They make them feel on top of the world. They build their confidence and then they make them crash out, which typically happens in a domestic violence cycle, anyways. But she went on to explain that it was this group of men's tactic to try to coerce them into suicide while they were feeling very vulnerable. Now, this situation was not men tired of their spouses wanting to live the single life or tired of their spouses and wanting to ensure they didn't have to pay part of their retirement to them, so they coerced them into suicide. But she was alleging these were very calculated men who sought out women they could coerce into suicide. And she said these were very high ranking men doing it because they are all a part of a cult. And allegedly, they believe they can feed off these suicides in some ritualistic manner that will give them energy to harvest and feed off of. It's giving Illuminati, if you will. So she went on to mention that a lot of these cult members are embedded in the swinger lifestyle. Put a pin in that. I'm actually going to come back to that because I get a lot of emails about the swinger clubs. Not inviting me to join them, just telling me that they're out there. And yep. Anyways, she said a lot of these cult members will go to the sex clubs and watch people who are either joining the cult or they recruit for it there. She also said she thinks a lot of these women being murdered by their husbands are actually somehow ordered by the high ranking men in our cult rituals. Again, this is not my conspiracy. I'm just sharing it. But this particular email actually got me thinking because all of these allegations coming out about P. Diddy and celebrities and satanic rituals in Hollywood, if you're current and you've heard of any of this, it's pretty crazy and scary. If you've read up on it or listened to anything, there's all these rabbit holes to go down about rituals and satanic worship in Hollywood. And there are a lot of stories of validity that show these celebrities are committing crime or whatever, and it seems to be linked to Satan worship or sacrificial and ritualistic reasons. We see all these satanic fashion things, like read about Doja Cat and Megan Fox and Balenciaga if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say like the satanic fashion and you're interested. And then we see all these celebrities throwing hand signs like LeBron James, if you want to read about that, that's a whole other thing. But all of these allegations that everything is related to Satan and worship and that they do these rituals as like a way to keep their riches and their fame. And again, I'm repeating the theories out there, not accusing anyone myself or saying I believe this. It's just a lot of things out there about Hollywood and satanic rituals right now. So when she sent that email, I was like, oh, this is really a lot of lunatics out there. Is it that out of bounds to think that some of these high ups in the military are in a cult and think that sacrificing people is getting them energy they can harvest for power and status and all of those things? Sounds absolutely ludicrous, but there's not a lot that I rule out as a possibility anymore. I'm on a tangent, but if you're curious about the Hollywood stuff, go listen to one of my favorite podcasts. It's called The First Degree. They cover it all amazingly, all of the Hollywood satanic stuff and the allegations against Diddy and Jay-Z and all of that. It's Alexis Linkletter and Jack Van Eck deep diving into conspiracy theories. They do true crime traditionally, but lately they've added these deep dives and it's super interesting. And I've always been someone intrigued in conspiracy theory and who reads all about them. I like to say I'd rather wear a 10 hat than a blindfold. So I was super stoked to hear that they like to explore them as well. I feel like I can literally hear people unfollowing this podcast as I say this, but I guess this is how I find my people. Let's see, what else? Lots of emails about being victims of military sexual trauma and rape stories. But like I've mentioned several times, I'm currently working on a spinoff season about that, separate from my discussions on domestic violence. And I actually have several victims lined up for that to talk about. So email me if you'd like to participate. Now, I've noticed a trend that it's mostly women of color who've come forward. It seems that in the military, racism is sadly alive and well. And so I'm hearing about a lot of women of color being raped and enduring MST. But I'd really like to interview a man for that subject matter or multiple men, because what many people don't know is men are being raped as service members all of the time. It's a huge problem as well. But the shame they're put through if they speak up just really silences them. I mean, we're talking about an echelon of men who a lot of them were raised to believe that men are men and are you crying? I'll give you something to cry about type of masculinity. So speaking out about being raped would be incredibly hard for those types of men. Also, it's often that these men are raped under the guise of hazing and brainwashed into thinking it's just boys being boys, when in fact, if the attack had happened to a female, it would be classified as a rape. I mean, if somebody actually acknowledged it, it would be classified as a rape. So I'm really working on gathering interviewees for that season. Again, you can participate and stay anonymous. Ooh, this is heavy today. Okay, so what else? I get lots of messages about the seedy underbelly of the swinging community in the military, as I mentioned before, which is no surprise to me. I was not a participant, just nothing I want to be a part of, but I was well aware that there was a big community of people who were involved in the swinging lifestyle in the military. And I've heard so many funny rumors for how you can tell who participates on base. For years, I've heard if you have a pink flamingo on your lawn, it's the like wink, wink, letting people know you're a part of the lifestyle. I've heard it's red light bulbs on the back porch, gnomes in your lawn. I've heard several times that if you have pineapples as decor, it's a nod to the lifestyle. Then I heard it was specifically upside down pineapples, which I always just thought pineapples were like an international sign of hospitality. And so, if not, I have just smiled and waved at many a swingers. But I've heard white rocks on your lawn, stars hanging from houses, which I just think so many of these things can just be consequential everyday items. So, and I just assume nowadays people have like online forums and sex clubs for that stuff. Do they really need to be orchestrating these elaborate, tacky lawn ornament displays to get the word out? I don't know. Just me. Who knows? I'm just sharing what I'm hearing. And now I want to make sure people know I still actually believe that there are many good people in the military and we need a military. And that's one of the reasons I'm so vocal about corruption is because I want to eradicate the bad. When I was 25 and married into the military, I had no idea this corruption existed. I thought that cops and the military were all good and could all be trusted. The awakening for me has been such a sad journey. And of course, we hear about bad cops all of the time. And I've also always been so pro cop. I'm believing that the vast majority is good because I have so many loved ones who are police officers. So negatively impacted when I hear about police corruption and violence and all of that. But I just never knew to what level military and police corruption ran. One thing I learned a few years ago that shook me was that gang members hold positions of power within large police forces, or they can. There was an article in Rolling Stones in 2023 about an investigation into Los Angeles County finding half a dozen active gangs and cliques within the police force. It alleged that deputy gang members have risen to high levels of department leadership. Now, to be clear, these aren't vigilante gangs, these are literal criminals embedded in the police force, seeking violent encounters with the public and operating like a mafia. Members have to be made and earn a tattoo, engaging in violence to become members, leading to coercive force and unconstitutional policing. They might actively try to get into a shooting or follow a suspect they believe have guns to then justify a shooting. These are bad people committing crimes for power and money. When I first moved to Southern California, one of my good friends was married to an attorney, and I remember her telling me that her husband was working on cases against the gangs of the Los Angeles Police Department. And I remember just chalking it up to like, cops doing vigilante justice against horrible criminals. I didn't realize that no, they were actually doing crimes themselves and horrible. There are many systems of corruption in this country and the world that people will be shocked and horrified to learn about, and I really hope to expose it all eventually. So, I've talked quite a bit about there being bad dudes in the military, and of course, those with combat PTSD and traumatic brain injuries. But one trend that I want to focus on in part two of this episode is this trend of young men murdering women. I want to talk a little bit about it. I'm seeing all the military spouse murders now, just more and more young guys doing this. And I recently made a TikTok where I posted about the victims killed by intimate partner veterans since the year 2000. And there's many more before that time and many after, but I focused on the year 2000 because the research is more readily available than in the 90s and prior. And I'm sure I'll get to those earlier years, but for now, I focused on the most recent murders and I found 101 women, children, and two men who were innocent bystanders taken out by veterans while the wives and kids were being murdered. And I didn't include the number of perpetrators who ended those attacks by killing themselves. And there's a lot more than 101 in that time frame. I just, I didn't want to do like a 2 hour long TikTok, but I did do 101. So, what stood out to me was that in the early 2000s, when it was really the height of casualties in Iraq, and these special forces soldiers were coming back from these really tumultuous, high conflict events in Iraq and really struggling, we saw a lot of gruesome murders. And those still continue, right? Just a few months ago, a veteran murdered his beautiful wife, Sarah DeGama, in Plantation, Florida, and their 2-year-old son. And thank God he did not get their newborn. But he'd been showing up at the VA prior to that, saying that he was really struggling with his PTSD and asking for help. So these types of events still occur to this day. But what I've been noticing more and more is this pattern increasing in young men with no deployments or combats under their belt, just 20-year-old men, maybe a little older or a little younger, murdering their wives. And that makes it really hard to pin the murder on their military service, meaning like you have to question, would it have still happened if they never enlisted? Possibly, but they should never have been in the military because they were unfit. I see this trend of them marrying so young. And then whether it's the financial burden and the stresses of life just causing them to snap, or they're just really involved in this life of partying and gaming, and they're living in areas surrounded by strip clubs and bars and debauchery and binge drinking. And their wife may have seemed like all they wanted as an 18-year-old about to head off to basic and not wanting to break up with his high school girlfriend. But fast forward a few years and she has become an inconvenience and chore to an otherwise life of fun. So there are lots of factors contributing to these young men killing their wives. So I'm going to call it for today. It's midnight here, and my toddler's going to wake me up at 4 or 5, best case scenario. But I promise in part 2, we're going to dive into those cases I discussed that happened in Hawaii and more on the topic of this trend of young service members killing women. I want to remind you, if you're in an abusive marriage or relationship and you're trying to escape, you do not owe them the discussion. In fact, I beg of you to not have it. Go quietly. Go with nothing if you must. Just your shoes. I don't even go barefoot. Just go. Don't warn them. Don't meet up with them. No matter how nice they're being or how sad and pathetic they sound, you don't owe them goodbye or closure. They lost that privilege. And more often than not, these last meetups are where we see these murders happening. Just get out. Thank you for listening. And if you want to help my cause, the best thing you can do is share my show with someone you think it may help. Please, please, please rate and review me wherever you get your podcasts. It's really the most helpful way you can help me spread my message. Thank you and stay safe.